Douglas Carswell, the radical Tory MP and libertarian, and his book is The End of Politics and the Birth of iDemocracy. And Douglas, you open up with the suggestion that one of the problems behind the growth of big government is simply that if you have differential tax rates and rich people pay more, it's possible for people to vote for big government in the knowledge that they won't be footing the bill.
That's absolutely right. One of the reasons why government has grown so big throughout the West, I argue in the book, is not the invention of universal suffrage, it's not the growth of democracy, it's the invention of unequal tax at the beginning of the last century. This, as you say, allowed the costs of big government to be passed over to your neighbour, or so people thought, and spread unequally. And as we've seen government grow, they found ever more innovative ways of concealing the costs. They started off with unequal taxation, then they resorted to borrowing, and since 1971 they've been manipulating the money to pay for it. But it's the end of the road for that.
One of the disturbing points in your book is that governments are losing control both of the money and of their tax base, because people can simply go elsewhere. The richest people are the ones with who perhaps have intellectual capital.
Right. Louis XIV's finance minister described the art of taxing as plucking feathers from the goose with the minimum amount of hissing. But because of the digital revolution, the geese, not just the rich geese, but a lot of geese can actually fly. And, you know, the thing that we tax, or the thing that governments tax increasingly, is intellectual property. And we're increasingly seeing that intellectual property is as mobile as an email. So it's going to become more difficult for governments to tax unequally and unfairly. But, you know, money, the nature of money is itself changing. We're so used to the idea of money being a government monopoly. I argue in the book that actually the digital revolution means that monopoly money system, monopoly money in the literal and the board game sense of the word, is coming to an end.
The idea, as I understand it, is that it would be quite possible for someone to have sort of an app on their superphone which will allow them to decide whether this week they want to be paid in pounds or in euros or in dollars or in whatever currency they fancy.
Or I think we can look at countries where they have payments using mobile phone and digital technology, but without banks. In for example, parts of Africa, they have the M-Pesa system. Once you enter the realm of being able to pay for things without expensive banks, with their bonuses and their expensive buildings attached, you begin to redefine the nature of money. And once we're no longer all forced to live under the tyranny of the George Osborne pound, government can't keep fleecing us through inflation tax. And so, you know, the hidden ways that government pays for more government begin, you know, the pillars on which big government rests begin to crumble. And I think it's quite an intriguing thought. And very few people in Westminster, I think, have begun to realise that the financial crisis is not just a crisis of the euro. It's not just a crisis caused by irresponsible banks and irresponsible lending. It's fundamentally a crisis for the Western model that maintains that you can have a Western-type welfare system based on a diminishing pool of wealth creators.
And what happens if at some point the financial base on which big government rests simply isn't there anymore?
Well, we're starting to see it. In Greece, I get fed up listening to rather cocky Brits looking at Greece and saying, ha, look at their problems. Actually, we're in a far worse situation. And what we're seeing in Greece, I'm afraid, I think we're going to start seeing in other Western countries. You know, I think Britain and America and many European countries are going to have to learn to cope with less government. It's a mathematical inevitability. People say, you know, people don't vote for Christmas, turkeys don't vote for Christmas, but, you know, December the 25th still happens. Unless politicians can reinvent the laws of maths, you know, what Greece has had to do, which is to scale down government spending dramatically, we're all going to have to do. That's the bad news. The good news, though, is that actually, thanks to the internet and digital technology, we don't need government the way that we assume we do. And I think we're about to discover, actually, the West was at its most dynamic and innovative when it had smaller government. And I think we're going to have to, and we can, have less government and be happy.
I wanted to explore that particular point, actually. What do you mean by the idea that the internet means we can have smaller government? Does that mean that we crowdsource the route of the next motorway? Does it mean that individuals are managing little budgets on their own to pay for their education, to decide how much to put in the pension this month or whatever?
Well, look at it this way. If you argue, as I do, that public administration in Britain under successive governments has been pretty inept at converting tax pounds into public services, public administration is going to have to start getting a lot more effective. And I think the only way you can do that is not to vote for this party or for that party. The only way you can do that is actually to say that individuals and families have to be allowed to commission some services themselves. Now, the average family in this country has about £30,000 worth of public services commissioned for it by government a year. Now, obviously, if you're going to be commissioning an opening ceremony to an Olympic Games, you're going to have to do it the old way. You're going to have to get government to do it. And I would argue that's a good thing to do. But there's a whole load of other services in there that I think people could commission themselves. Now, for example, per child, it's between £6,000 and £8,000 per pupil that government spends. Why not allow mums and dads the ability to do that? Now, the conventional argument has been parents don't know what good looks like. Well, thanks to the internet, we can use collective wisdom and collective intelligence to make really sophisticated decisions. We can for the first time ever, if you like, have a market in sentiment, not just in price and brand. And I think that will allow people who perhaps don't know much about the education system themselves, like me, to make some pretty sophisticated choices about what's right for our children.
Would everybody do that, though? Or would you find that just a few people were using the system and quite a lot of people were being used by it?
Well, at the moment, I think we all have a system of stand in the queue and wait. If government, as I say in the book, if government ran supermarkets, there'd be catchment areas for breakfast cereals and a waiting list for vegetables. Now, why is it that when government commissions and runs services, we've not really had the sort of transformative changes that we've experienced as consumers in other aspects of our lives? When it comes to what I watch, iPlayer, BBC iPlayer, or what I listen to, Spotify, iTunes, or where I shop. There's been a revolution in my ability to select what I want. But when it comes to what government gives me, I still have to stand in line and wait. And I think we can, for the first time ever, begin to ensure that public services are actually run by the individual members of the public who use them and not decided by remote officials and experts.
Well, that's one of the things, again, I wanted to raise with you. You're very hard on experts in this book, almost to the point of arguing that anyone who knows anything about anything is automatically disqualified by their own self-interest.
Well, yeah. Obviously, if I was getting on an aeroplane, I'd want a pilot who is an expert at flying. But an awful lot of public policy mistakes in the West, the decision to build tower blocks in South London, the decision to have child-centred learning, the decision to, have mega low interest rates for 20 years in the belief that it could make us all rich. These are all mistakes imposed on the rest of us by a conceited, arrogant, out-of-touch, expert group of people, a technocratic class. What I argue in the book is that actually, those who hold that human, social and economic affairs are best organised by grand design, they're not an avant-garde. They've actually led us off a cliff. And one of the reasons why the West is in this mess is because we've deferred public policy making to this class of experts who are actually pretty useless. So, I think we could do without expert public policy decision makers and let the public actually determine public policy.
But couldn't you just as easily be led off a cliff as the result of some sort of internet-generated opinion polling as you could be by experts?
Well, I tend to trust, sometimes the people in aggregate get things wrong, but I can't help noticing that most of the great public policy failures of our time, the euro, Alan Greenspan economics, Mervyn King's management of the interest rates, most of the public policy disasters that we faced as a society have tended to come not just from the top, but as a result of the conceits of the elite. We all like the idea of this sort of expert class, but actually they turn out to be pretty fallible. Again and again and again, the crowd tends to have a greater wisdom than the priestly elite.
Well, I do have reservations about this, because you can see a situation where you have, as it were, government by rolling referenda, which in turn follow kind of emotional spasms. And we see it quite a lot at the moment, that there is great sort of upwellings of emotion on this, that and the other, and 3 weeks later everyone's wondering quite what all the fuss was about. And that's probably not a particularly sustainable way to run a government, but it seems to be the way you're pointing.
Well, I think your argument's an argument against democracy, and I'm quite sure that, in the 1830s, when people were arguing whether the vote should be extended to ordinary people, we would have heard similar points of view put forward, saying, these emotional masses, they don't know what's right for them. Actually, that's simply not the case. People are pretty good at making pretty discerning judgments about what's in their best interest. Let me put it this way. Again and again and again, we defer to politicians and officials to make decisions on behalf of all of us. We're trapped into terms of thinking that collective decisions have to be made this way. It's perfectly possible now, I think, to make collective decisions as collectively as ever before, probably more inclusively than ever before, but without deferring to a technocratic elite. And, again and again and again, I see examples where, we don't actually need people like me to presume to know what's best for society, and I think that's a good thing.
And in which case, what is representative democracy for?
Well, indeed, as I argue in the book, we've got a 19th century system of democracy born from the days when the fastest thing in the country was a train or a horse, and we're using it to hold to account a 21st century size state. It doesn't work. Just think of the words West Coast rail fiasco. It doesn't work. So maybe what we need is to have a direct system of democracy, so that when we do need elected officials, we can use direct democracy to make sure they actually do the things we want. But
what would those things be?
Why should things be made that way when it comes to things like education? Consumerist decisions should be made by consumers, not by parasitical politicians pretending that they have the best interests of everyone at heart.
And what's left to the parasitical politicians to actually decide at that point?
I think if we had a minimal amount for politicians to decide, if politicians decided on very few things but did them well, I think it would be good for the country and good for the rest of us. Frankly, do we really need to have a national curriculum so that every politician throws in their tuppence worth, decides on a curriculum that we then impose on every child? Why can't we have a tailor-made curriculum plan for every child? I mean, I think the children that I represent in my constituency are important enough to have their own curriculum. It's technically possible to do it. Why should people like me impose a national curriculum on hundreds, millions of different children? We don't need to organise society that way anymore.
Now, you first hit the national headlines in the last Parliament when you were the first MP to stick their head over the parapet and call for the resignation of the then Speaker of the Commons, Michael Martin, over his handling of the expenses scandal. Now, I get the feeling that rather fits into the narrative that you're unfolding for us now, that this actually is quite ideologically consistent. It wasn't just a sort of separate event somewhere.
I have a real problem with all unaccountable concentrations of power. It's the one thing that I don't like to be angry, but the thing that gets me very angry is when I see people who preside over the rest of us and aren't accountable to the rest of us and think that they are representatives of some unaccountable oligarchy. And I see again and again and again the reason why this country is in a mess, the reason why our political system isn't responsive, the reason why the banks were run so badly, the reason why I don't think we get what we should from our public services is because they're run by oligarchies. We like to think of ourselves as more democratic than we've ever been, but in a sense this country is in the hands of an unaccountable little oligarchy sitting in Westminster and Whitehall, and I think it needs to be opened up. I think the oligarchy needs to be taken on.
And you argue in a sense that your view is now riding the wave of history, that government isn't going to be sustainable in the size it is for very much longer for all sorts of reasons. How do we get from here to there?
Well, there are two ways.
Does it just happen?
We could do it the Greek way. We could carry on pretending that we've got money we don't have and carry on with the sort of insane economic policy that we've seen under governments of all three parties now for the past 20 years, throwing credit at a problem created by excessive cheap credit, and then we'll wake up one morning and we will find that it's not just in Greece that they can't borrow money. The bond bubble will burst in this country. I think it'll probably go in Japan first, but it'll be a hard landing like Greece. Or we can recognise that actually what we now need to do is ensure that there are massive changes to the way that public administration is run. Give the public control. You can do this actually relatively simply. For example, education. Pass a law that allows mums and dads in my constituency a legal right to request and receive their child's share of local authority funding. If you did that, very, very soon you would see people coming along and giving them the tools, the online tools, to make discerning judgments about the kind of education that they want for their children. I think it could happen remarkably quickly. If we start to do it now, it'll be a lot less painful. If we carry on believing that we can run an ever-growing welfare state on the back of an ever-shrinking wealth-creating base, we're going to wake up one morning and it's not going to be pretty.
I can see our sequel in gestation already. Douglas Carswell, thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
And Book Talk will be back again next week. Do join us then.